Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast presented by Bee Culture. Beekeeping Today podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flatham.
Hey, Jeff and Kim. Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hives protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Now is a great time to consider what type of patty is right for your area and your honeybees. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you out of their manufacturing plants in Airdrie, Alberta, and in Butte, Montana, or from distribution depots across the continent. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sherry. We really appreciate our sponsors' support. They help make all of this happen and provide us the ability to expand and grow, as you will see, starting today. With that, thanks to Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been the magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today, and while you're there, check out Bee Culture's Beekeeping Your First 3 Years, a quarterly magazine for beginning beekeepers. We also want to thank 2 Million Blossoms as sponsor of this episode. 2 Million Blossoms is a quarterly magazine dedicated to protecting all pollinators. Learn more on our Season 2, Episode 9 podcast with editor and guest co-host Kirsten Trainer, and from visiting www.2millionblossoms.com, and that is with a number 2. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. We're glad you're here because we have another great show for you today. Hey Kim, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay, Jeff. I gotta get this in right away before I forget. Bee Culture is our sponsor, and Bee Culture has just released the 42nd edition of the ABC and XYZ of Bee Culture.
Excellent.
Editor Keith Delaplane and myself and about 50 other people made contributions to this one. It's available on the webpage, and get your copy before they run out and have to reprint.
Wow, wouldn't that be? That's a great one, and just in time for Christmas too. It's almost like you planned it.
We did.
Well, excellent. It's been a while since that's been out, right? This is the first time.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I want to say it's been 10 or 12 years since the last edition came out. The 41st, I did that one with Dr. Shimanuki from the USDA Bee Lab. The one before that, the 41st, or the 40th, I did with Roger Morse. So this is the third one that I was involved in. And I'm going to be honest, I'm glad it's my last. It's a 3-year job to get that book out.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of great information in there, and it's a perfect gift for the beekeeper on your gift list this year. Hey, Kim, at the beginning of the show, we talked about the help of our sponsors and what that does for us. Have you noticed anything special about our website?
Well, I'd be letting the cat out of the bag if I said no, Jeff. Yes, I've seen what you've been up to, and I give you all the credit for making it happen and for getting it up and running. It looks great, and it's a lot of information there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a great. We've always been frustrated by our website because it didn't give us the ability to do things we wanted to do and provide our listeners with information and the flexibility that we wanted. And we finally got this new website out. It's a great new layout. We'll be adding new photos and more photos. It even gives us the ability for our listeners to leave written and verbal messages to us. So instead of trying to track down our phone number or something like that, you can go out there to the website and click on the little microphone and leave a verbal message. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or you just want to say, hey, guys, doing a great job, you can leave them there on the website verbally. And will also give us the ability to leave, put up transcripts from the show for our hearing disabled beekeepers who can enjoy the podcast by reading about it. So it gives us a lot of features, what I've mentioned, and more that yet to come. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, you should be. It looks great, and of course, everything there is free. Mm-hmm. So come, spend some time, take a look, and some things coming out in the future, Jeff. I know that you're looking at some kind of a newsletter or a blog
Yep.
That we can send out, and all we'll have to, it'll be email. So when that's available, we'll let you know. You can click in, and we'll send you a copy.
Yeah, we on the podcast we get a lot of information from a lot of different people about upcoming events and news alerts, and not everybody has access to all of the that we do. So this gives us the ability to put out an occasional newsletter, or like you said, the blog. It's a great addition to the podcast, and I hope our listeners get out and check it out.
Yeah, good job, Jeff.
Oh, thanks, Kim. So you've been busy. Well, I've been building websites. You've been busy yourself, haven't you?
Well, I tucked my bees in this week. Finished tucking them in, and I've been working with Jim too on a new podcast.
A second podcast. You're not leaving this one. You're not leaving this one.
No,
you're starting a second one.
No, this one, we deal with people in the industry who are involved in current and advanced research. A lot of, not exclusively, certainly, but Jim and I, we'll get together and we'll sit and have a beer, and we just talk bees, and that's what this new podcast is about. It's called Honeybee Obscura, which means everything honeybee. And the first two that we did one on emergency feeding. What equipment do you need? How do you do it? And the second one we did is what's the hardest thing you have to do keeping bees every year? And he's got his problems. I got my problems, and I'm sure everybody else has got some kind of problem. But we kind of laid it out, and we didn't solve a lot. And that's often the case. I'm just going to tell you my troubles, and I'm going to go home, and you're not going to help me because you don't have an answer yet. But sometimes you do solve them, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to look at everything honeybee.
Very good, and it's going to be a short, not a short, but it's a deep dive look at specific problems in each episode.
Well, I don't want to say problems, issues.
Issues, yeah.
Because another one that we've got coming up is what's the best thing about keeping bees. So there's no problems there. So,
no.
But they're going to be, 15, 20 minutes max.
Oh, good. So it'd be a nice thing to listen to in between whatever someone's doing, and you don't have to devote a lot of time to get a lot of good information.
Yeah, we're looking for the guy who lives almost next door to work to do it on his way there.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Hey, up here and just north of me in Auburn, Washington, there's a small college called Green River College, and they have a bee yard where they've kept bees for educational purposes and research, and they're in the middle of a year-long study on and research on wintering bees and success of bees, and just the year-long process. Well, this last week, they went out to their bee yard, and all 20 of their research hives were destroyed by bears. And they're just if anyone who's seen bear damage in a bee yard, it's total. It's not a happy sight.
That's gonna be awful.
Oh,
yeah.
It is really bad. So the beehives, the bees were used for teaching and research and overwintering. Is a year-long project, as I said. So they're scrambling now to try to. They've lost all that research, or most of it, because they won't be able to complete their year-long study. But they want to rebuild the bee yard for next spring, and they've opened up a GoFundMe site. And I'm not related to the college. I've not talked to them prior to this, but I'm going to suggest that listeners go out to the website in the show notes and click on the Green River College GoFundMe site link that we'll have there. And, if you can, send them $20, $10, $5. They'll take whatever to help them. They have a goal of reaching $20,000 to rebuild their yard. So I encourage our listeners
I hope they build a bee fence or a bear fence this time, too.
Yes, I saw on their website that is definitely on their list of things, a stronger, more dependable bee fence or bear fence. Also in the news this week was the Asian giant hornets.
The killer hornet. No, the murder hornet.
Yeah, I don't use that word.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, the folks from Guelph have been doing some work with Serena over in, I think it was Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that they discovered was somebody noticed that there was some kind of dung, some kind of poop on the front door of Serena hives, and somehow this managed to scare off the giant Asian hornets. And now people are wondering, well, should I be putting that stuff on the front door of my beehives?
And if you thought spilling honey robber in the back of your car was bad, wait till you spill a jar of poop smell and that you're going to put on your beehives.
Well, there's going to be guard bees inside the front door going, wipe your feet, wipe your feet, wipe your feet. And that reminds me, Jeff, of wipe your feet, kids. And this is the season for kids books. And another one came out. I just got it last week, and it's for kids who have had troubles with bees in the past. Jeff, Christmas time is always good for kids books, and this year has been no exception. I've gotten several in the mail, and one arrived just yesterday, and I want to tell you about it because I really enjoyed it. It's called Kia and the Bees, and it's written by Mary Beth Boltz, and it's illustrated by Angela Dominiques. It's published by Candlewick Press. It's got 33 pages, and it's stunning, what's the word I want? Stunning art all throughout the book. It's really done well. So let me tell you a little bit about it. This is a book for children who haven't yet been introduced to bees and beekeeping, or at least they've had an unpleasant experience with a bee in the past that caused them to be afraid of bees, or at least to view them unpleasantly, unfavorably, and unfortunately, I guess. The author is a beekeeper, and in the book, his father is a beekeeper, and they live in the city with several hives up on the roof. But Kia isn't part of that activity by choice, because she was stung long ago and is afraid of being stung again. However, in all other things in her life, Kia is brave. Capital letters, bold, underlined, and she'll tell you that, brave. And claims not to be afraid of bees with her friends until one day, it's going to happen, at school. A bee lands on her arm and she gets really frightened and her friends see her, and that's it for her being brave. To change that, Kia goes up on the roof with her dad. And she has a good time. She enjoys the bees and all the activities and watching them and watching her dad work. But then she gets stung again, and that's it for the bees and beekeeping for the rest of the summer. Brave girl or not. But then it's time to harvest. And the wonders of honey once again convince Kia to try bees and beekeeping. You can relate to the issues with harvesting, I think, Jeff. There's honey on the floor, on the table, on my elbow, on the doorknobs. We've all been there and done that. And this will convince you that the author's experience, she really is a beekeeper and has been there and done that. What happens then is what makes this such a good story for almost anybody, but especially children with issues for bees. And so if you know somebody that might benefit from this, I really encourage you to go out. At the end of the book, Kia goes to the roof again. Because bees are amazing and scary and mysterious, and we need them. And now something inside me is brave once again. It's a good book, Jeff. If you know somebody 8 to 10, get this for a Christmas present for them.
Hey, thanks a lot, Kim. That's another great book review for kids just before the holiday season for Christmas. Check it out, folks.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's get into our interview with Tobias and QSI-America. But first, a word from Strong Microbial.
Hello, beekeepers. Your honeybees face a lot of challenges out there. Unbalanced food sources from monoculture crops, holding yards, drought, food shortages, antibiotics, pesticides, and pathogens like chalk brood. To overcome these challenges, your bees need the multiple bacteria that are in all nectars, pollens, and the environment. These bacteria aid honeybees' digestion and improve your honeybees' response and resilience to pesticides. Now you can help improve your honey colony health with a quick, easy, and safe-to-use product. Strong Microbial's Super DFM honeybee uses naturally occurring bacteria to restore the healthy gut biome of your honeybees. Check them out today at www.strongmicrobials.com.
Hey, Tobias. Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
It's nice to meet you, Tobias.
Nice to meet you as well.
I've been interested in your work for some time, the work that you people do it for some time, so it's nice to get a chance to ask you these questions.
Yeah, you're always welcome. So pretty excited. What are the topics today and what do you want to talk about?
Well, just everything you do. How's that? We'll just sum it all up.
Yeah, let's see.
Well, a good place to start, I think, Jeff, don't you, is who is QSI and basically are you, where are you located and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So we are a private contract laboratory. So we are not a state lab. We are basically the private side of testing. So everybody who wants to test honey or other products can send them in and we offer testing services. We are located in Corona, California. So not the best name in these days, but it's close to Los Angeles. And we are basically one lab of a lab group called Tentamos. And as the name says, QSI-America, we also have another QSI, which was first, and this is located in Germany. So I'm German as well. I was working for the QSI company in Bremen for more than 10 years. And in 2018, I moved over to California to basically implement the honey testing here in California for the US market, just to be closer to the client.
Very good.
So,
and are you permanently stationed here then? Or do you have to transition back or do you?
No, I moved everything, my complete family, my complete household in one container. So everything is here and now California citizen.
Oh, very good. Well, welcome. That's good.
Thank you.
Well, you mentioned that honey is on your list. I know looking at your webpage, you also look at other products, but we, of course, are interested in the honey side of it. And what do you test for? What can I, as a hobby beekeeper, send you a sample of my honey and have you test for what?
Absolutely. So if you want to test honey, we are talking about like three big sectors of honey testing. And it starts pretty easy with quality and labeling. So this is pretty much the test that you would imagine to just say, okay, what is the basic quality of my honey? So did I, as a beekeeper, a good job with my bees together to see, okay, for example, is my moisture content okay or not? So basically, you can imagine the nectar is harvested by the bees, and then it's dried in the beehive. So if you decide to harvest too early, maybe your moisture content is too high. So you could have a risk of microbiological spoilage of your product. So you want to be sure that your moisture level is not more than 20%. So you could send in a sample and we just would test for the moisture level, for example. So as an easy test. There are some other tests, like, for example, sugars. Of course, honey is a sweet product. We can test and say, okay, how much glucose, how much fructose is in your sample. Depending on this ratio, you can kind of predict if your honey will crystallize or not in the future. So it's a so-called fructose-glucose ratio. And if this ratio is low, the probability is very high that your honey will crystallize. If this ratio is very high, your honey will stay liquid for the longest time. Yeah, these are some basic tests. And there are some tests also which can actually show that your honey is raw. And there's a lot of labeling at this moment where people want to differentiate their honeys from other products and say, okay, it's actually a raw honey. So there is a parameter called HMF. It's a long chemical name. It's not really important. What is important is that generally nectar and fresh honey doesn't have any HMF inside, or a very, very low concentration. We are talking about milligrams per kilogram of this substance. And if you treat your honey for processing or for getting out of the beehive, or you want kind of pasteurize your honey and you add heat to your honey, you can see that this parameter actually increases. So we can actually differentiate and tell you, okay, this honey was just treated a little bit with heat, just maybe to just liquefy the honey to get it easier out of the comb, or to just fill it into jars. So if you make a mild heat treatment, this is completely fine. And you can see that this parameter increases just a little bit. But if you decide to cook your honey for whatever reason, or just treat it with a lot of heat, so it's not natural anymore, we actually can see this and can tell you, okay, it's lower than the limit or higher than the limit that is set for this kind of raw or not raw.
What happens when I warm my honey crystallizes and I need to reliquefy it and I'm going to warm it? And there's, if it's a bottle, I can put it in a pan of water, but if it's a pail or a barrel, then I'm using a band heater or one of the submersible heaters. Is that going to change the HMF value of my honey to the point where I can't use any of those natural honey claims?
Yeah, so actually you can't exactly predict what happens because every honey is different. They have different chemical properties. But I can give you some ideas, some temperatures and some times that are correlated to these temperatures. So how much time does it take actually at this temperature to exceed the limit? So if you heat it up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, so 40 degrees Celsius, it would take you around 50 days to exceed the limit. So this goes pretty much very fast down. Yeah. So if you just increase the temperature by 10 degrees Celsius, so we're talking about 122 degrees Fahrenheit, you just have 10 days. Same game at 140, it's just 2 days. And if you decide to heat it up to 158 degrees Fahrenheit, you just have 10 hours approximately. And if you go higher, you can see it drastically goes down. So it's pretty critical if you heat your honey up to maybe 50 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Celsius, or if you go higher than this. So if you go higher, it's kind of exponential. Yeah. Curve. So you should be careful to just heat it up around 40, 50 degrees Celsius. And then honestly, nothing really happens. If you do this for one day or something, it's fine.
So slow and easy is the rule here if you're going to uncrystallize your honey.
Well, that's really interesting. And so I guess that also leads to being able to identify somebody who ultra purifies their honey because they have to heat it up so much to pass it through the filters. Or do I have that wrong?
Yeah, kind of. So to actually pass it through all these filters and to remove all the pollen and grains and everything that is inside, it actually is much easier if you heat up your honey. So this doesn't mean that you have to heat it up in such an extreme way that your HMF raises, but definitely there will be an influence. So HMF will raise during the ultrafiltration process because you can't basically filtrate your honey at room temperature. So you have to heat your honey up. Ultrafiltration actually is a pretty interesting process. And it's pretty interesting because the consumer in the US, I guess, is very used to liquid honey. So you have your squeeze bottle on your breakfast table and you want a good form of honey, just squeeze it out of the squeeze bottle. This was pretty surprising for me when I came here to the US because in Europe, it's the other way around. People pretty much like crystallized or creamed honey. So because they don't want that the honey runs off the bread or the whatever you put your honey on. And it's actually pretty interesting that the consumer perception is so different. And I brought to some employees here, I brought honey from Europe and I showed them and say, hey, this is a creamed clover honey. And they were surprised and they were skeptical and said, I never saw this kind of honey. And they kind of liked it at the end, but it was completely strange for them. So it was pretty surprising that a product, such an easy product like honey is so different in perception between Europe and America. So
I blame that on Winnie the Pooh because Winnie the Pooh always ate the liquid honey.
Yeah, and it's also correlated to the botanical origin. So from the southern states, like for example, orange blossom honey is kind of a honey that is always liquid. So of course, in Germany, there is no orange blossom trees or no farms like in California or Florida, for example. So the botanical origin from Germany tends to have more crystallized honey, where the southern states here in the US tends to have more liquid honey, just for the different nectar types.
So I see that you, from the website, you also do pollen analysis. Is that I would think that's an important part of your business as well. Identifying source, a country of origin, honey types, etc. Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty much the technique itself is pretty old. So how it works is you basically take your honey, you dissolve it in water, then you centrifuge it, and you just take the sediment, put it on a slide, and just go to a classical light microscope like you maybe used in school, and just look at the pollen. So this process to just prepare this is pretty easy. But then it comes into place to just know, okay, what shape, what structure, what size is my pollen, and then you actually start to count pollen on your slide and on your sample. And this work actually is extremely difficult. So I can't do it myself. We have specialized employees, and they need around 3 to 4 years to actually get fully to identify all pollen and to count them in a reproducible manner. So this is extremely difficult, and there is no fixed number, but there are approximately 40 people on the world who can actually do this and just identify all the pollen, give you a pollen spectra, and then you get a botanical origin as well and a geographical origin. So I can tell you, okay, this honey looks like it's from Florida, maybe, or it's a European honey, or it's an Asian honey, maybe from Thailand or Vietnam, or it looks like a Chinese honey. So you're able to differentiate this.
And you're telling that from the pollen, the different types of pollen.
Yeah. So there are some very typical pollen. Like for Cuba, for example, they have a special king pollen, which basically just grows on Cuba. So if you find this pollen in your honey, you can be pretty sure that this honey comes from Cuba. There are some other marker pollens, lychee, for example, lychee pollen. You can find them mostly in Southeast Asia. So from this, you can see, okay, how does it look like and where does it come from? But it's not just looking at the pollen microscopic preparate itself. It's also to taste the honey actually and look at the color and all the physical chemical properties to just see, okay, my honey is maybe dark amber, but the client tells me it's acacia honey. So you're pretty sure, okay, even if you find a lot of acacia pollen, this would never be an acacia honey at the end of the day. So yeah, so they actually do the microscope and they also taste it and smell it and use all their senses to see what kind of honey it is.
No wonder it takes so long to learn how to do it.
The people down in Texas A&M also come up with the ratios of the pollens that they find in their samples. And some of those ratios by themselves tend not to be accurate because some plants produce tons of pollen and some plants produce almost no pollen at all. Are you looking at your samples like that?
It's absolutely correct. Yeah, we do this. And so we do for the geographical origin, you basically have a spectrum of pollen that you just look, okay, which pollen types are inside my honey. If you want to know, or if you want to classify as a botanical origin to say, okay, this is a pure acacia honey, or this is a pure orange blossom honey, for example, you have to count your pollen and you have to do the percentages. And you're absolutely right. There are plants which are producing a ton of pollen. So chestnut, for example, is a good example. So the correlation between the nectar percentage and the pollen percentage actually is interrupted there. So there you have a lot of pollen, but you don't have so much nectar. We take this into account, and there are some guidelines and some scientific literature which tells you, okay, if you want a chestnut honey that is a chestnut honey, you have to have more than 90% of the pollen that you count should be chestnut. The other extreme example would be lavender honey. Some lavender types are completely sterile, means they have no pollen at all. So you make a pollen analysis and you see a lot of pollen, but no lavender pollen. But you can see, okay, from the flavor and from the color, you can see, okay, it's a lavender honey. And for some lavender types, you maybe find 1, 2, 3 pollen, absolute, not percentage, just pollen. You see one lavender pollen and you're, okay, this is a lavender honey. But the flavor is very specific and the color is very specific to lavender honey. So this is the other extreme. For some other pollen, it's pretty much correlates. So if you see, okay, I have 50% pollen percentage of this type, you can say, okay, for orange blossom, for example, it pretty much correlates. And what we can't see, what is also interesting, for example, talking about orange blossom honey, it's pretty popular and everybody says orange blossom honey. Actually, we can't differentiate between citrus pollen or lemon pollen or grapefruit pollen or orange pollen. All of them are the same plant family and all the pollen look exactly the same. So if you tell me that your beehive was standing in an orange blossom or an orange tree farm, okay, we can tell you it's probably an orange blossom honey, but we can't tell you and it's a lemon or grapefruit or whatever citrus species. So this doesn't work.
Huh. Well, I'll go back to being the hobby beekeeper in Northeast Ohio, is where I'm located, and I send you my sample, and I was worried about it because I had to liquefy it, and you tested the HMF, and I also ask you can you test the pollen and tell me what my bees are visiting this summer? And it sounds like you can, but the question is, how much is this going to cost me?
Sure. So, of course, it depends if you send us one sample or if you regularly send 20, 30, 40 samples. But just to give you a ballpark price, a pollen analysis costs you around $100. And HMF analysis for the heat parameter is around $40 to $50 in this ballpark. Some very easy analysis like moisture, for example, or color is around in the $10 ballpark. So it really depends how difficult it is to do the analysis in the lab here.
Yeah, well, I can also see where it would benefit me as a beekeeper to be able to say with accuracy that my goldenrod honey is really all goldenrod honey, or the early spring honeys, I could say. So a test like that has a value, especially if I'm selling my premium honey for more than what's on the shelf, because I'm able to say that it's goldenrod honey or whatever it is. So I can see that it has a value. One other thing that Jeff, I'm sure you've worried or at least thought about is, did I leave my apistan strips on too long? And can you find if I did?
Yeah, sure. So actually I started to say, okay, that we have 3 areas of honey testing. So the other 2 areas are actually residues and contaminants that your question is relating to. And the third area that we will talk later about, I guess, is authenticity of your sample. So for residues and contaminants, we absolutely test for this. If your treatment of your bees was in a timely fashion and like the prescription said, so how much time you should have and how much stripes you should put in your beehive. So we absolutely test for this. And to give you an idea in which concentration or what concentrations we are talking about. So for the sugars, we're talking about percentages. So this is something that somebody can really imagine and say, okay, I know how much is a percent, how much is 1% of something. But if you're talking about this kind of residues, we are talking about micrograms per kilogram that we are testing it. So to give you a better picture, if you take a Boeing 747 and put it on a scale, we can actually tell you if the captain has his little clip on his on his tie. So this is the difference we can tell you. And we actually,
very sensitive.
We actually can tell you the name of the clip. So name of the pesticide. So this, just to give you an idea how sensitive these methods are and which concentration range we are talking about if you talk about residues and contaminants in the honey.
Does that even apply? Well, I'd be curious is if someone used contaminated supers from the prior season for honey this year, would that have enough residue in the wax perhaps to leach out into the honey the second year?
Wax is actually a very good, like a magnet for all the residues, because the residues mostly are more fat soluble than they are water soluble. So you can see residues in the honey itself. So there are some pesticide and bee treatment residues that you can see, but actually the wax accumulates it. So if you're producing organic honey and you want to show that you never used any kind of treatments in your beehive, you actually can prove this very good if you take your wax and if you analyze your wax and you can find nothing in your wax of your beehive. Coming back to your question, if you use any product that is contaminated and it's not just feeding, it could be also your color that you use to paint your beehive, your wooden material, for example, or any other kind of things that you put in your beehive, all of this can potentially contaminate your honey and lead to residues in your honey. So absolutely.
That's sensitive. Wow.
So do you test a lot of beeswax? Is that fairly common?
It's more for the organic honey, really, to monitor that you didn't use over the last period of time any pesticides. Mostly it's focused on the product itself, on the honey. As the honey is sold as an eatable product, mostly the test is done in the honey itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things on your webpage says that you are looking for GMOs, and I'm guessing this is going to be pollen that's in the honey?
Yeah, so there is actually or a very low amount of free DNA in the honey. So what we do is we look on the pollen and which of these pollens are actually coming from genetically modified plants.
Well, in some parts of the U.S., that's going to happen a lot because of soybeans and corn, I imagine. And if you're testing for GMO, testing your pollen for GMO material, probably the only thing you'd have to do is identify the pollen and say, yeah, this is soybean pollen, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be GMO. Am I close there?
I saw a statistic which said like 97% of the world's soybean production is GMO soybeans. So if you see soy pollen, the probability is pretty high that it is GMO pollen. But what we are doing in the lab actually is we do real-time PCR. So the same system that is used for the coronavirus test, actually. So we actually check for the actual DNA of this pollen, and then we can tell you exactly first, if there's GMO inside, yes or no. And we can even identify which GMO soybean was used or what is in the honey. And you're absolutely right. So US, honestly, if you check US honey for GMOs, the probability is pretty high that you have some GMOs inside because most of the crops are GMO nowadays. The same is for other countries like Argentina, for example. Argentine honey mostly has GMOs because all the soy for the cattle. Yeah, so it's pretty much like this.
Yeah, living in the Midwest, you're going to have a problem with that. One of the other things that I was noticing here, you say you're testing for heavy metals. Is that a common problem?
It's not very common in the US. It's more common for imported honeys. The risk is so high because it can come from any side. So the bees itself won't intake heavy metals or something like this. So it doesn't come from the bee, but it can come from the beehive itself, for example. If you put there some metal rods inside or from this mesh where the wax is on, if this is stainless steel, nothing happens. But in some other countries like India is having big problems, for example, there you have a contamination with lead in your honey, which is sometimes present. And it can come from the beehive, or if you ship your honey, you put it in a big drum, and maybe this drum is not coated very good, or the coating is falling apart or something like this, if it's a very old drum. So there are various ways of contamination of your honey with heavy metals. But again, the risk in the US is pretty low. On the same time, especially in California with Proposition 65, heavy metals are very well monitored, and people are very sensitive to heavy metals.
Interesting. Well, the whole discussion then on imports, and we've had Eric Winger from True Source and others talk about adulteration and origin, a country of origin. Do you do a lot of that analysis then also, testing for did it really come from the country that's on the label?
Yeah, so this is a pretty hot topic in the last decade, I would say, because there are things going on, especially in Asia, with transshipment, so that honey actually. So I think the most important information is that there is a big import charge for honey that comes from China. So it doesn't make any sense to import honey directly from China to the US, because the import taxes are so high that it doesn't make sense. So what you can actually see is that that countries that never exported honey, like Malaysia, for example, are increasing the honey exports, and people are, of course, asking, where is this honey coming from? And then you can see, okay, maybe it's transshipped honey that is just shipped from China to Malaysia and then from Malaysia to the US. So could be possible. Of course, the pollen analysis comes in place again for this testing to see, okay, what pollens are inside of this honey, and does it look like a Malaysian honey or is it more like a Chinese honey? But there are also other techniques that we can use to actually see, okay, is this a country of origin, or is it a blend of some other honey? So we have some other very sophisticated methods with NMR, for example, is one method that is pretty new and that is used for detecting this kind of things. And of course, you have the problem or the issue of feeding your bees over times where you have no nectar flow. So feeding is absolutely okay, and you have to feed your bees to just have them survive winter times or times with no nectar flow. But this product that you have in your beehive is actually no honey, because you just fed your bees with sugar syrup or some other products. So you can't sell this as honey. And there is a limit of 7%, which is tolerated. So even if there is a little bit cross-contamination of this syrup honey with real honey, it's fine, and a little bit is tolerated. But there are actually countries who are constantly feeding during the complete nectar flow. They are constantly feeding their bees with sugar syrup just to increase their profit and their yield per beehive. So this is a bad technique, and this is something that you should not do, and which is not a good beekeeping technique. We can also analyze this, and we can pretty fast see if your honey is authentic or if something like this happened. And of course, there is a big branch which is not very common in the US, luckily, but in Asia, there is a big industry of just commercial adulteration of honey. So you harvest honey in a very good condition, it's 100% authentic, and then you basically start to mix your honey with other sugar syrups, and just to make more honey out of your harvest.
And you're able to identify that through the analysis, if they're mixing it with different syrups or different sugars?
Yeah, so I would say 98% yes. So everything in the US, if you mix with corn or with cane sugar, this is pretty easy to detect. But it's like a game between the labs and the fraudsters in Asia. So China has very sophisticated syrups, and they actually promote these syrups and tell to the client who's buying this and say, hey, if you buy this syrup for this price, you can bypass this and this and this analysis of our lab. And they actually promote this even with test reports from us and tell them, okay, look here, if you buy this, if you add this and this syrup, you can add this percentage, and actually they are not able to detect this. It's kind of a game between the fraudsters and the labs, and our goal is to make it so difficult to produce a syrup and to make it so expensive to produce a syrup that bypasses all the tests that we are offering, that it's commercially not sensible to adulterate anymore. And just to say, okay, you know what, just do regular beekeeping, get back to the roots, and just make a good, authentic product. And we don't need to mess around with all this kind of tests.
So what kind of tests are you performing on these honeys that have been adulterated with these sophisticated sugars?
Mm-hmm. So the basic test that is now on the market since 30 years, it's to look on the stable isotopes. So the carbon from the sugars in the honey, there are actually several forms of carbon, and there are different isotopes. So we are not talking about radioactivity or something. It's just stable isotopes. There are different forms of carbon. You actually can differentiate them between normal flowers where the honey took where the bee took the nectar and made the honey out of it, and from cane and corn sugar, for example. This test doesn't work for sugars that are generated from rice, for example, or from sugar beet. And especially rice syrup, it's pretty popular in Asia, so they use this rice syrups. And so then we develop more tests and to see, okay, are there special substances in the rice syrup which we actually can detect, and to tell, okay, is this rice syrup or not? State of the art at this moment is to do the isotope testing and to make the NMR testing. So NMR stands for nucleus magnetic resonance. So it's the same like the MRT system that you put your total body in and you can see something inside. It's basically the same kind of test. It just has a little different tweak. So we just put the honey inside, and what you get is like a complete fingerprint of all organic substances that are in your honey sample. And you get like a fingerprint of your honey. And what we do is we have a database that we developed over the last 4 to 5 years. And we have more than 20,000 samples in this database full of authentic honey that we know, okay, this is authentic honey from, for example, Florida. And then we compare your honey to this database, and without knowing what we're actually seeing, we can see on this fingerprint and say, okay, the fingerprint looks exactly the same like the other 200 honeys we have in the database from Florida, for example. And then we can say, okay, it's okay, and there's nothing strange. If you see there's a deviation from the database from your sample, we can say, okay, there is something strange, and now the actual work starts to say, okay, what is different? Is this maybe just a different botanical origin, a plant that we never saw before, a plant nectar? Or is this a different beekeeping technique, or you name it? So it could be something different, but the chance is pretty high that if we have 200 samples from a certain origin in the database, and you send us a 201st sample and it looks completely different, that something is strange with your honey. And probably this kind of is related to kind of non-authentic product.
Could that change based on the climate that season, that year, the soils if those were to change over a period of time, would that change it so much that you could not tell the difference?
It will change it, or it is changing, and we can see this, but it is still changing within the statistical model that we have. And and this database thing is an ongoing thing. So we didn't start the database and said, okay, we will end it ever. So of course we wanted to, but we figured out, okay, it's such a moving environment, and with climate change, all the vegetation is changing. So there are new plants maybe in some countries that are never been there before. So the profile changes slowly over time. So we are keeping this up to date, and we are actively working on this database to just have a good model and see, okay, to keep the fingerprints, the authentic fingerprint up to date, and to be able to judge your honey if it's authentic or not.
It would be kind of interesting to see if there's any correlation over time with actual climate change for the different chemistries of the honeys and your honey fingerprint, for lack of a better term, and try to draw that correlation over the last, since they've been tracking the climate change. That would be kind of interesting.
That'd also be very useful not that any beekeeper would ever do this, if I had a competitor who said, I got pure Ohio honey, and there's no adulteration going on here, but I could send it to you, you could look at it, and you say, no, this is from North Dakota, no doubt about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's something So the limit, to be honest, there are limits on all the methods. So, for example, if you are living on the border from North to South Dakota and you want to say, okay, is this 1 mile north or 1 mile south of the border of North or South Dakota? Honestly, we are not able to differentiate this. So there has to be a difference in the actual botanical surrounding where the beehive is. But I think from Ohio to North Dakota, the difference should be good enough. And even with a classical pollen analysis, we would be able to differentiate this and tell you, okay, this is not Ohio honey, and or this is more or less your fingerprint. And of course, if you add to your database a special model and say, okay, this is maybe very special honey from Ohio, and you make a special Ohio model, as if the model is more specific, you can be also more critical with your honey and say, okay, this doesn't look like Ohio honey. It's still authentic, but it doesn't fit in the model for Ohio. So you can do this kind of things with the NMR pretty good.
What's the turnaround time for a test like that?
The general turnaround time that we have is 5 business days. Also for the NMR, it's the same turnaround time. We can go down to same business days for some tests if it's necessary. Not for NMR, but for most tests would be possible. If it's really urgent, and you want to ship your honey or you want to market it for whatever reason very soon, so it's possible for most of the tests.
Well, a week is pretty good.
How big is your team there?
Yeah, in total, we have 35 people working here in the lab, split it between microbiology and the chemical lab and the actual biochemical lab for the GMO testing. We have around 20 people working on the actual lab.
And you just mentioned microbiology. What are you looking for in that category?
Yeah. So honey is one of the few products where actually microbiology is not so important like for all the other products. So in general, if you do food testing, the first question is always, what about the microbiology and salmonella and pathogenic microorganisms, whatever. Honey, fortunately, if your water content or your moisture content is lower than the 20%, it's a pretty dead product because there's so much sugar inside that even if you have bacteria inside, they won't grow. So that's why the moisture content is so important. So we can test for microbiology, especially if you want to use your honey and maybe make a cough syrup out of it. So you basically add water or other ingredients. This would actually be a good starter for the microorganisms in your honey if you just add water. So it would start to ferment, for example. So typical thing, if you make honey wine, you just add water to your honey and it starts to ferment because there are yeasts in your honey. Just natural yeast from the flowers, from the bees, so from the air. So there are yeasts in the honey. We can see them under the microscope actually as well. But there is no need to test your honey for microbiology in the first place if you just want to sell your honey. Just make sure your water content and your moisture is lower than 20%. If this is good, you're actually good to go and you don't need to test for microbiology.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you guys can do just about everything when it comes to making sure that what's in that bottle on that shelf is what it says it is, or it should be anyway. What have we missed?
Yeah, we can start everything from we even test the label, which is on your honey bottle, because regulations from FDA can be very specific, like to put a nutritional value on it. And some regulations are very specific. So we have some experts who can actually take a look on your label and say, okay, this is FDA compliant. We can test as well for antibiotics. So sometimes people want to treat their honey with antibiotics to say, okay, what helps me maybe helps also my bees. So some of them actually are approved. And this is important to understand, that you have to have an approval for a certain substance that you can use it in honey. Comes with a big license to just use this. But especially in foreign countries, again, in Asia, there are some antibiotic residues that they are using which are not allowed. And actually, honey as a natural product should not have any antibiotics inside. So this is the basic idea of this.
And the same with pesticides as well?
Pesticides is a pretty big topic. So, of course, no beekeeper is adding pesticides to the bees, because most of the pesticides are actually very toxic to bees. But glyphosate, for example, is one good example that is used everywhere, especially on the GMO plants. So you can see that most honeys in the US are actually positive for glyphosate. And there is no limit for glyphosate in honey. So every residue of glyphosate would actually be critical. And it's just really about the bees who are collecting water and nectar and parts from the plants where the glyphosate was used, and as well other pesticides. If you think on orange blossom honey, a lot of pesticides are applied to the orange trees, or even for the almond pollination, there are a lot of pesticides in use. And my personal opinion is also that this kind of stress leads to this colony collapse disorder. So it's a multivariate factor of stress to the bees, of pesticides, which are actually taken from the bees, and other factors. So, yeah, but you definitely can see this and use honey as an indicator for the environmental quality and to see, okay, how's my honey quality? And then you can be pretty sure what's going around 3 to 5 miles around your beehive.
It'd be interesting to have a map of the United States and see just like a 3D map, and you could see where different areas of concentration of different chemicals are. And so in the Southeast, it might be one thing. In the Midwest, it might be another thing. In the West right now, it'd be smoke. It'd be interesting to develop that kind of map based on the data that you have.
Yeah. What is actually pretty interesting is that honey that was where the beehive was in a city, like there is a lot of this city beekeepers who are like beekeeping in Manhattan on a hotel in New York there, or some other airport honey, for example. And we tested various of these honeys, and actually the quality or the residue level there are no residues inside, because there is no commercial agricultural activities in this kind of cities. And even the smog from the cars you can't see this because the concentration at the end is not big enough. But these city honeys, or you ever want to call them, are actually pretty good on the quality. And everybody's concerned and say, hey, if this is an airport honey, can we see some traces of maybe some organic solvents of some kerosene or whatever? It's actually not the case. And
interesting
for the honey that we tested for. So yeah.
That's interesting to hear that the urban beekeeper's honey may be more organic than the beekeeper sitting out in the country.
The probability is pretty high. And even for the bees, sometimes the country, it looks full of flowers, but if you really look deep into it, and it's a big cornfield, for example, corn has no flowers. So for them, it's like a desert. So an urban beekeeper in an urban surrounding, you have so much different flowers and botanical parks and little parks. So maybe it's even better for the bees to have them in an urban environment than actually on the countryside sometimes. So,
yeah, well, interesting.
Very diverse environment. Jeff, you had a question earlier. Does the organization test propolis?
Yeah, as well.
Okay. For the same things.
Wow.
Propolis is actually a very difficult material. So if you handled propolis yourself, you can feel it sticks to everything on your fingers. And it's the same in the lab, to be honest. So you can test for the same things. Some tests would not be so sensitive. It interacts also with the equipment. But we can test for the same things. And also for things like the flavonoids, for example, in the propolis. So the actual active substances, which are proven that they have an antibiotic activity. So they actually help you to kill germs on your skin, or when you take like this propolis things to swallow, for example, there is actually an antimicrobial property to it. And we can test this, we can prove this. So, yeah.
So how does someone submit a sample to you? Yeah. How do they reach you?
It's pretty straightforward, to be honest. So normally you just would go to our website, QSI-America.com, and there's all the contact information. So typically you just send me an email and you ask for a quote. So you tell me, okay, this is the honey I have, and these are the tests that I'm requiring. Or maybe you have no idea and you just say, okay, I'm a beekeeper, and how can I show that the quality of my honey is better than the honey from my neighbor or whatever. So we are also good in consulting, and we consult normally and see that the client is really just testing what the client needs to test and not something else. And in the end, he gets a PDF and he has a result and what should I do with this result? And and now, so we really focus on have a good consultation before any test starts. And then it's pretty much easy to send us a sample. Typically between 2 and 4 ounces are required for honey. You just send it in to our lab in Corona, a little paper which says what test do you want. Then you wait the 5 business days, and then you get a PDF of the result back. And if you have questions for what the result means and is it good or not or whatever, just call me, just send an email, and we can give you also interpretation of these results and can tell you, okay, maybe there are next steps to say, okay, there's a little bit suspicious result for the authenticity, for example, and then we can recommend some further steps. But in general, this is a process.
That sounds simple enough. And how many samples are you doing a month?
To give you a bigger picture, so with the lab in Germany, we are probably one of the biggest honey labs among others in the world. And we are doing a month, roughly 9,000 to 10,000 honey samples.
Whoa.
Wow.
Okay, yeah.
And it's all around the globe. So also very special honeys. So we are testing for a Caribbean island at this moment, for example, that they just started to want to build up a supply chain for honey and have a very special island honey from their island. And it's actually a pretty good quality of this honey. So, and clients are pretty much from a beekeeper with 1 beehive up to beekeepers with thousands of beehive, supermarket, retail, honey importers, honey exporters, all the supply chain till to the final client who is maybe interested and say, hey, why my honey is crystallizing, or is it really raw honey? Can you check the HMF for me, please? And we work for all of them.
Pretty much everywhere on the planet.
I was thinking your lunchroom probably has some pretty good honey samples, leftover samples that were tasted really good. I'd like to swing by your lunchroom sometime.
Yeah, so some of the raw honeys where you have bees on the top and everything, we don't give them out to the employees. But the diversity of different honeys is actually pretty impressive. And
that would be wild.
Even after 13 years now working with this product, it's still learning every day something new. And there is a new species of botanical origin that you never saw before, and you're tasting this honey and said, oh, this tastes very interesting, and I never had this taste before. So it's everyday learning, even after 13 years of being in the honey business.
Well, Tobias, I think this has been fun. I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have picked up some good information on what you're capable of doing and making sure that the honey that we make here is even better than it is now.
Yeah, we can't make it better, but we can prove that your honey is better than the other one.
Tobias Wiezorek, thank you so much for being on the show, and look forward to hearing more about you in coming years. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I really learned a lot listening to and talking to Tobias. They do a lot of research, a lot more than I thought they did.
Well, yes, they do. And I guess my only comment would be I wish beekeepers would take better advantage of them. I know they do thousands of tests, but they should be doing hundreds of thousands of tests, I think. Most beekeepers could test for moisture, and that's okay. And most beekeepers know that if you heat your honey too much, your HMF is going to go up to the level of being toxic even if they overdo it. But the thing that he brought out was the amount of fraudulent honey coming out of Asia. Yeah. And then you take a look at the USDA figures for imports from Asia, and you got to wonder, what are these people thinking? That where was in the UK, they tested every jar of honey in a grocery store, and every jar that didn't come from the UK was contaminated. And it's going to be the same on my grocery store down the road here.
Yeah.
If it isn't from the USA, it's probably going to be contaminated, and you got beekeepers in this country trying to make a living selling $2.50 a pound honey, and I can buy it from India for 85 cents, and that's just not going to work for very long.
No. What really surprised me was him talking about the GMOs in honey. That threw me off. I didn't expect that at all.
Well, from where I'm sitting, I've got going that way and that way. I've got soybeans and going that way and that way. I can see from the lab here where I'm sitting, I got corn. So I know I got GMOs in my honey. And I'm not even going to argue with anybody. If they say you got GMOs, I want to say, yes, would you like more?
Yeah. Well, that's one way of approaching that.
If it's bad, make it better or something. I don't know, but we don't have a choice.
No,
our bees are going to go.
That's exactly right. Well, that's surprising, but and it's a matter of raising awareness and understanding what they're doing, what the bees are bringing in, and what you can do with it.
I also like the part where they were talking about the antibiotics. There's another one that we've opened that door again in this country, but under the watchful eyes of veterinarians. So I hope that doesn't become an issue.
Yeah, and he's talking about along the same lines. He's talking about testing of wax and what they're finding in the wax. And wax is such a sponge. We know that for everything, but what he's finding in the wax is just amazing. Yep,
it's scary. And then you make it into a candle
and burn it. Yeah.
No, it's good to know that those services exist. The beekeepers can take advantage of them.
Yep.
That you send your stuff in, and when you are selling your honey, you can be very certain that what you are telling the buyer is correct, because here's the results of the lab test.
Yeah, I think it's a very valuable service, and would encourage people to look into it, and beekeepers to look into it. Well, that about wraps it up for this podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or our website, and wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. Even better, write a review and let other beekeepers looking for a new podcast know what you like. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their continued support of the Beekeeping Today podcast. We want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. We also want to thank Strong Microbials for becoming the latest supporter of the podcast. Check out their probiotic line at www.strongmicrobials.com. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments at questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. In fact, you can even do that on our website today. Anything else you want to mention, Kim?
I think we've spent enough time today, Jeff. I'm going to go find another book to read.
Very good. Take care, everybody.